Where we're going to face threats from time to time. This country will face threats from other nations, and we as people from time to time will come in contact with, we live in a crazy world, and sometimes there are real threats that we face, and then sometimes they can be imagined. But even if it's imagined or if it's real, a lot of times it can cause the same reaction. We can be fearful, we can be anxious. Some threats that we may face in this life may prove to be nothing more than just, an imagination of our own. It's false. But other times it can be very real. And today, the world in which we live in, it's hard sometimes to distinguish between what is real and what is false. When you have news outlets who seem like they want to over-dramatize things, because the more dramatization they can make, Brother Todd, the more viewership they're going to get. So, it's hard sometimes to know if what you hear is real or if it's just an over-dramatization. But we hear all kinds of things. When you turn on the news, you hear things about wars and rumors of wars and political threats and political taunts and natural disasters all over this land, all over this world. So the fact is, real or imagined, whether it's a threat that is real or imagined, it can cause the same amount of anxiety. It can rob us of our peace of mind. Do you understand? Do you agree with what I'm saying?
Amen.
When you hear something negative, a lot of times if you allow yourself to dwell on that, it can rob you of your peace of mind. As I was reading this lesson the other day, yesterday, this was in my book. I don't know if you have it or not, but many of you that are in here were living during the 1960s. How many of you in here were at least adults, age 18 or older in the 1960s? Raise your hand. Several of you. So people living in the 1960s that were adults will probably remember this. But if you were living during the Cold War in the 1960s, this country came face to face with a threat that could have been very, very real. It was real. But it could have came to fruition. Thankfully, it did not. But the United States and the Soviet Union lived under a dark cloud at that time of potential nuclear war. And each side fought in the shadows. We don't even know what was going on behind the scenes. But, each side fought their fight, and they were playing an intelligence game, if you will, and they were trying to outwit and outspy each other, the United States and the Soviet Union. And at times, the Cold War would emerge, it would kind of drift off into the background. You wouldn't hear that much about it. But then other times it would be in the news, and it would just be the total focus. It became center stage. And such was the case in 1960 during a meeting of the United Nations, where a man by the name of Nikita Khrushchev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union, he responded very angrily to a delegate who criticized the Soviet Union for actively inhibiting freedom for people around the world. And this angry Khrushchev, that was his name, Khrushchev, I'm probably not saying that right, but he walked up to the podium there at the United Nations where they meet. And some reports state that he took off his shoe and he banged it on the podium. Now, I don't know if you're aware of this, but in some cultures, when someone takes off their shoe and threatens to throw it at you, that is a very high form of showing that you hate someone or you have a disdain for someone. It's just an act, showing an act of hate. But some reports say that this leader of the Soviet Union took his shoe off and he banged it on the podium. Others say that he basically just took it off and he waved it around violently. I don't know if you all remember, but this was just, maybe 15 years ago when George W. Bush went to somewhere, and it was an Iraqi journalist that took his shoe off and actually threw it at him. And then after he threw one shoe, that wasn't enough. He took the other one and he threw it at him. And George W. Bush had the wherewithal to duck both times, and it missed him. But the reason why he done that is it was a way of showing, I can't stand you, I hate you. But anyway, I can just imagine people in that audience looking at this, watching this angry man beat his shoe on the podium. And all who heard that when it hit the news cycle were probably struck with fear. Well, what is the Soviet Union going to do now? And this war, it began to boil over. This potential for war, it began to boil over between the Russian people and the United States. And that was a very real threat to us at that time. You know, both nations, the United States and the Soviet Union, had stockpiled enough nuclear weapons that we could have annihilated not only each other, but we could have annihilated the entire planet if we wanted to. But thankfully, that Cold War, it cooled off, and it just kind of drifted off in the background. And eventually, when Ronald Reagan became president, the famous words that he said was, "Gorbachev, tear down this wall." In other words, the war is over. The threat of war is over. Just tear this wall down. But, you know, we may worry about threats that we face in this life. Sometimes we can allow our imagination to run wild with us to the point that we can't even sleep many times. We find it difficult to sleep. We can blame our fears on this or that. Some of them prove to be very real. And when those times come, when we are facing a situation or a problem that is very real, we have to understand that yes, the situation is very real, but we also serve a very real God. And that's what we've got to remember. And that's what Hezekiah was doing right here in these scriptures that we just read. It's during those difficult times that we've got to seek the Lord in prayer, and we got to trust Him right here, just as Hezekiah did in the book of Isaiah. I know the day in which we live in today, it's pretty rough. You can see that when you turn the TV on, but I've often said, getting back to the 1960s for just a minute, I've often said if I had lived during the 1960s, I was not born until 76, but I've read the history on that decade. If I would have been living at that time, I would have surely thought that the Lord was going to be coming back. Very, very soon. And he could make his return at any time. We know that. But I'm just saying that was a very tumultuous time in the world, in this country. We lost a president by assassination. We lost Martin Luther King Jr. by assassination. We lost Bobby Kennedy by assassination. The Vietnam War was heating up. The Cuban Missile Crisis. Can you remember all those things? Yep. All you people that were adults at that time, that was just a terrible time in this country.
I think that was the closest, was the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yes, that was very, I don't know if any of you've ever, that was
90 miles off the coast
of Florida. Right.
Cuba.
Yeah, just, that was a very tumultuous time in this country. I don't think we even know what all President Kennedy faced during that time. But when we have threats that come against us, or something difficult comes our way and we just don't know what to do, the enemy will like to rob us of everything that we know to be true. He'll like to take our faith and our peace of mind. But we know during those times we've got to put our trust in God. And this was Hezekiah right here. In those scriptures we just read, he faced a very difficult situation for himself and his people. And I'm sure he felt afraid, Sister Lola. Yes, he was king, but he was also human, and he felt afraid. You have to understand something. The Assyrians were the ones making the threats. They were an especially cruel people. They were a war machine, and they had destroyed so many nations. They began to even name them off in those scriptures. Here, look at all these people that we have destroyed, and they seemed to be unstoppable. And they would roll through countries and they would just eliminate every resistance that stood in their way. And they were the ones that would take the rings and put through the cartilage of the nose. Have you seen pictures of that? That tough cartilage at the tip of your nose, they would put those rings through their prisoners of war, and they would put those rings there and tie them together with chains. Can you just imagine how painful that would be to that prisoner? They would burn out entire villages. That was the very reason why Jonah did not want to go to the city of Nineveh and preach salvation to those people, because he knew what kind of cruel people that they had been in the past. These were the Assyrians. The capital of Assyria was Nineveh. They were terrible people, and Hezekiah knew that. And they had already came and destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel at this time. In 722 BC, the 10 tribes that made up the northern part of Israel had already fallen prey to the Assyrians. They had came and scattered them abroad and taken them captive and just destroyed the land. And the reason why God allowed that to happen is because they had begun to worship false gods. And so God allowed that to happen. Only the kingdom of Judah remained. And those were the two southern, the two tribes that made up the southern portion of Israel. Hezekiah was a good king. Remember, I told you at times the land of Israel would have good kings and bad kings, especially the northern one they had a lot more bad than they had good. But the southern portion had a little bit better luck with kings, but Hezekiah was a good king to the southern portion of Israel. He ruled over a small kingdom, and here you've got this small kingdom being faced with a threat. A war machine is threatening to roll their way, and here he is. I'm sure he feels just helpless and hopeless. But there was one thing he knew. His faith was strong, and he knew that God could take care of this situation. And he had a strong faith in God, and right here that faith is being put to the test. He had a choice to make right there. Was he going to continue to trust in the Lord in the midst of this very real crisis that could prove not only deadly to him but to all his people?
Right.
Or was he just going to give in to the enemy? He had a choice to make. But honestly, what choice did he have? You can't just roll over and give in to the enemy.
That's right.
And I think this lesson is a strong reminder that no odds that are stacked against God or his people. Greater is the God that we serve than any other force that may come against us. So what's happening here in these scriptures? Isaiah the 37th chapter, verses 9 through 20, that's where we were at today. The king of Assyria sent his emissary. And remember, we talked about that word last week. An emissary was basically a person sent by the king for a mission. So through his emissary, the king of Assyria did not just taunt Hezekiah, but he felt so emboldened and mighty that he didn't just threaten Hezekiah, but he went after Hezekiah's God, our God. He so brazenly mocked Hezekiah for trusting in God in Isaiah 36 and 7. He proclaimed that the Lord had told him to come to Judah and destroy it. Not only did he mock the Lord, but he told a lie right there on the Lord. He said the Lord had sent me. That was a lie. So even worse than putting words in the Lord's mouth, the Assyrians tried to claim the one true God was a liar, and that's very dangerous ground there. That is very, very dangerous. The Lord, like I said a while ago, had allowed the northern kingdom of Israel to fall prey to the Assyrians previously. And, maybe he might have allowed Judah to go through that same fate. But you know what? God was angrier at the king of Assyria right there for mocking and lying. God had granted a reprieve to Judah. when the Assyrians had came against Israel before, it was just the northern part that was destroyed. God had allowed Judah to survive, but maybe Hezekiah was worried that, maybe God wouldn't allow us to survive this second invasion. But he still had his trust and his faith in the Lord. He feared for himself, but above and beyond that, he feared that if his people heard the taunts from the Assyrians, what happens when people as a whole start to hear some bad news? What happens? That news begins to what?
Spread.
It'll spread, and it'll do what else? it'll grow, won't it? It'll magnify itself. It could start out as just a little thing, and the next thing you know, it's a big thing. But as king, Hezekiah wanted to keep his people safe, not only from the enemy, but safe from their fear. And he faced a great challenge here in these scriptures. Trust the Lord or seek help from another country. He could have went and tried to get help from another country, but he knew. I don't know why it is that many times our first instinct when trouble comes is to seek help from everywhere else. Yeah. We will go to the banker. If we're having financial difficulty, we'll go to the banker.
Right.
If we're having legal difficulties, we'll go to the lawyer.
Right.
We'll go to a friend. We'll go to a family member. Why not seek God first?
Mm-hmm.
Why not seek God first, middle, and last, and leave it there? But, here he was. What should he do to try to help save his people? I'm sure he tossed things over, back and forth in his mind. Do this, do that, what should I do? In the end, he knew the power of his God would deliver his people. And we've heard the miraculous stories, and he knew that his people knew who the one true God was. But they also knew the reputation of the Assyrian people, and that was a well-earned reputation. They were cruel, cruel people. But in the midst of all this and him pondering this, Hezekiah, just to kind of add fuel to the flame, he received some discouraging news. One of the enemy's taunts came real. For Hezekiah, here he is. I'm sure up until this time he had been very comfortable as king, sitting on the throne. But I'm sure that throne became very uncomfortable for him during this time. Because, when the decision lies totally with you, it's easy for someone else to sit back and criticize or say you should do this or you should do that. But when it comes down to when you're the one that's got to make the decision, it's a heavy weight to bear. And I'm sure that royal robe that Hezekiah wore at that time felt pretty heavy. He had a burden, but he had a heart that also trusted in God. So what was he to do? He tore off his kingly garments. He put on sackcloth and ashes. He went into the temple of the Lord to seek the face of God. What a righteous king that was, that he is there in those scriptures. He shows us to be. The land of Judah was very blessed to have a king that would do what he did. He put all of his comforts aside, and he did what was best for him and his people. In times of discouragement and fear, a lot of times we find it difficult to pray. I've been there so many times in my life where I have been going through something or a difficult time spiritually, a difficult time in the natural, and you find it difficult to pray. You don't even know really how to pray sometimes. You don't know what to pray for. Right. Sometimes all you can just say is, Lord, just your will be done in this situation. Whatever it is, Lord, that you're wanting me to learn from this situation, help me to learn it and help me to learn it quickly and help this thing to pass for me. But when those difficult times and we have a real need, we're going to feel frozen, unable to act even. But during those situations, it is so important that we summon the faith and the courage to seek God's direction in our own lives. We got to press past that fear. And we got to press past that logic that seems to say This is just impossible. Have you ever been faced with a situation that in your natural eye it seemed impossible? You could just see no way that it was ever going to work out?
Right.
We got to press past that when we're faced with that, and we got to summon the energy to pray.
Amen.
Logic was not on Hezekiah's side here. Logically, he's looking at this massive, mighty army of people coming against his little country, land, the land of Judah. The threat was dire. The Syrians had the ability to just come in and destroy, level that place, and take every single person as captive. Unless, everybody say unless God intervened.
That's right.
And we're fixing to find out just how big our God really is.
Yeah.
We often face enemies that are more real than we like. When the doctor tells us that cancer is there, that's real. That's something that you have to face. When it's invaded the body and we know that it has the potential to do us harm, that's a very real threat.
That's right.
Sometimes you may be threatened with legal action, or you may be going through a financial difficulty, a house payment that you can't make, or doctor bills that you can't pay. When those things happen, we feel weak and unequipped to respond. But it's during those times where we got to pray. I was informed just a couple of weeks ago, and if I called the man's name, you would know who this is, but a man of God and his family were actually verbally attacked. But they were also threatened with actual physical violence because a neighbor claimed that he had killed their dog. So the neighbor came to this man of God, a pastor, came to his house and verbally attacked his children, and then made actual threats. I'm going to come back with, what I'm gonna take this out on your dad when he gets home. Of course, later the dog that he claimed had been killed by this pastor showed up safe and sound. But this is how crazy of a world that we live in. That was a very, very real threat for that man of God and his family. When someone threatens your family with violence, what is your first reaction?
Do something.
I'm going to get my gun and you just come on back, buddy. That's your first reaction. I want to handle this. You're not just going to come and do my family harm. I was also reminded, the reason I'm saying this is because, yes, we are faced with real threats from time to time in our life. I went to work with a man one time who, for some reason, felt that he could share his story with me about his dad. His dad was also a minister. I don't know that he was a pastor, but I know that he was a man of God, a minister. And he took his family to church every Sunday. But they had a neighbor. And we've had crazy neighbors before ourselves. You never know. But they had a neighbor who was going through a divorce. And he was fixing to lose his visitation rights with his children because he had anger issues and all kinds of drinking issues and all those things. He was fixing to lose even his visitation with his children. And he went to his neighbor who was a preacher and said, look, I'm fixing to lose, I won't even be able to see my children unless I have someone there who can supervise these visits every week. And the man told him, he said, look, I've got a family of my own. I wish I could help you out, but I can't be there the whole time I can't make that kind of commitment. I'm sorry. Later on, the man went home. I guess he got drunk and began to think about it. He went back home, got a gun, and came and shot and killed that man. And this was the son that I worked with. That one man ruined an entire family. He took a father away from his children. He took a husband away from a wife. And he lost everything in the process. He no longer had visitation with his children except through a glass in the jailhouse,
Right.
It just doesn't seem logical that someone would do something like that. So we're going to face threats in this life. Some are real, some are imagined. But here we have Hezekiah facing this dire situation in Judah. And this is what he said in verse, he said, this is the day of trouble and rebuke in Isaiah 37:3, and of blasphemy. For the children are come to the birth, and there is not strength to bring forth. Hezekiah knew what they were facing. He tried to have faith, and he tried to keep thinking good thoughts, I'm sure. But he also knew the enemy had gone too far. Because even if God was upset at Judah at this point because they had allowed sin and idol worship to come in, he knew that God might be upset with the land of Judah. But he also knew that God was going to be upset because of the way the Assyrians had rebuked and mocked him. And Hezekiah said this. He said, it may be that the Lord thy God will hear the words of Rabshakeh. That was the emissary that the king sent, whom the king of Assyria, his master, hath sent to reproach the living God, and will reprove the words which the Lord thy God had heard. So he's hoping at this point that God's going to be angrier with the Assyrian people than he is with the land of Judah. And you know what? In difficult situations, it is so important to seek the counsel of the man of God. And you know what? That's what Hezekiah did. The book that we just read those scriptures from comes from the book of Isaiah. So who do you think Hezekiah sought out for help? The prophet Isaiah. He sent messengers to the prophet Isaiah in the hope that God would act on their behalf. Right. And you know what? Isaiah was the right man to call. He was the prophet in that land. He had godly wisdom, and he had a spirit, a good spirit. He was just what the people of Judah needed.
That's right.
God spoke to Hezekiah through the prophet Isaiah, and this is what he said in Isaiah 37:6-7. Thus saith the Lord, be not afraid of the words that thou hast heard. What a relief that must have been to Hezekiah. Be not afraid of the words that thou hast heard, wherewith the servants of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me. So yes, God heard that blasphemy, and he was not happy with it. Behold, I will send a blast upon him, and he shall hear a rumor and return to his own land, and I will cause him to fall by the sword in his own land. Listen to that last line. He's talking about the king of Assyria right there. He said, I will cause him to fall by the sword in his own land. You know, right there, Hezekiah received a word from the Lord. His faith was built up. A lot of times what happens when we're going through a difficult situation and the Lord makes his presence known and our faith gets built up, what happens immediately after that sometimes? The devil's going to come back with something else. Go ahead, Sister Mary.
Sorry.
I need a drink of water. Go ahead.
Well, in 2 Kings 18 was the first threat, and 2 Kings 19, that's Isaiah gave them that prophecy, the word from the Lord, and then right after the man of God, the prophet, spoke, became the second threat, and that's where it came in the form of the letter, and he laid it out at the altar before God.
Right.
But in 2 Kings 19, verse 37 is the prophecy fulfilled where he said he'd fall by his own sword.
Yeah.
If you read that, it tells you right where he had fell, and someone else reigned in his stead.
I'm glad Sister Mary's in 2 Kings because not only can you find this story in Isaiah the 37th chapter, but you can find this account also in 2 Kings the 19th chapter. Is that where you're at?
Yes. Well, you know, we can come to church and we can come to the altar for prayer. We can feel good about that, and then we go back out, and sometimes something has seemed worse. We got to hold on to that word. We got to hold on to what God said. We got to hold on to the.
That's right.
Written word.
You stay right there in 2 Kings the 19th chapter. I'm gonna have you read a verse there later on.
Okay.
But yes, you can find both accounts of this in Isaiah 37 and 2 Kings 19. But here we are. The enemy has trying to tell Hezekiah, I'm not finished yet. And I'm quickly running out of time, but I want to get through this. The enemy sent a letter to Hezekiah, once again blaspheming God, calling him a deceiver. And if that wasn't enough, he began to list off all these examples of people, the conquests that they had done before, all the nations that they'd conquered. The Assyrians wanted to point out to Hezekiah how powerless he was, and that there's no other God that was going to stop them. And they began to name off all their victories. Hezekiah didn't care about those victories. You know, when the Assyrians would go into battle, an ancient battle of any kind, they would not only spoil the city, they would burn it to the ground, they would take people captive, but they would take images of their gods, false gods.
Right.
They would take them and they would parade them around in the countries to show, here I have conquered this land and their God.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that Assyrian king thought he would do the same in the land of Judah. I'm going to go into this land. I'm going to burn it to the ground. I'm going to take all the people captive. I'm going to go into their house of worship. I'm going to take out their law. I'm going to take out their scrolls. I'm going to take out everything. And I'm going to parade it around. And I'm going to display my victory. But that didn't happen. Hezekiah would not give up. The king once again made his way to the temple here. Hezekiah was a good king, made his way to the temple, asking God once again to intervene. If the enemy doesn't leave after your first prayer, pray again.
Amen.
Yeah.
That's what Hezekiah did right here.
Amen.
I've had this happen to me many times in my life, where you'll pray, you'll feel that faith, you'll feel that deliverance, you'll feel that just that touch from the Lord, the enemy will come right back. Pray again.
That's right.
That's right.
Hezekiah not only prayed, but he laid that letter out before the Lord. He did something just a little bit different. He laid that letter out before the Lord on the altar, and he appealed to the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel.
Right.
He proclaimed the oneness of his prayer in Isaiah 37 and 16. I'm going to read that quickly. The oneness of his prayer, he proclaimed the oneness of God in his prayer. Isaiah 37 and 16. O Lord of hosts, God of Israel, that dwellest between the cherubims, thou art the God, even thou alone.
Yeah.
So he's proclaiming the sovereignty of God right there. He pleaded with God, bend your ear to me, hear what I'm saying. Help us, O Lord. And he reminded him of the rebuke and the mock and all of the things that Assyrian king had done to undermine the authority of God. And the Lord reassured Hezekiah once more that everything was going to be all right. I think this story of Hezekiah is so powerful because it lets us know that God does hear our prayers. When the enemy comes to us and tries to tell us that no one loves us, that no one cares about us, that the work that we are doing is not going to matter, it doesn't make a difference,
Right.
that in the end it's not going to matter anyway. You know, those are taunts from the enemy. We all face those. When we hear those things, we can just remind the enemy who is powerful and the God that we serve. Greater is he that is in us than he that is in the world.
Amen.
When the Lord called on the prophet Isaiah to speak to Hezekiah, and like I say, I'm running out of time, I want you to understand what happened. In the end, this Assyrian king was going to find out the hard way just how real the king of Israel, the God of Israel really was. That night, read 2 Kings, Mary, 19 and 35. We're fixing to find out what's going to happen to these Assyrian people. Go ahead.
Now therefore, O Lord our God, I beseech thee, save thou us out of his hand, that all the kingdom even thou only.
Okay, is that 19 and 35?
That was, I'm sorry, that was 1919. I'll read 35. I'm sorry.
That's all right.
And it came to pass that night
That night.
that the angel of the Lord went out and smote in the camp of Assyrians 180,000. And when they arose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses.
So that 180,000. How many is that, people? 180. What's 80? 185,000. If you looked at 180,000. That night, the very night that Hezekiah laid that letter on the altar and began to seek the Lord, that night God sent His angel to intervene. The Lord, this is in Isaiah 37 and 36. Sister Mary just read it in 2 Kings, the 19th chapter. But it says, the angel of the Lord went forth and smote the camp of the Assyrians, 180,000. And when they arose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses. See what the Assyrians had planned to do to the land of Judah? It just came back on them. I read in my Bible yesterday that the king of Assyria, after that happened, he fled to the capital city of Nineveh. What did that scripture say was going to happen to the king? That he would die by his own sword in his own land. After that happened, he fled to the capital city, Nineveh, and his own sons came and took his sword and killed him. So that prophecy, that scripture that we read just a few minutes ago, it came to pass. This was a good lesson. I wish I could have done a little bit better teaching it. I thought the story was great, and I ran out of time and had to skip over things. But I guess, in summary, when our problems overwhelm us in this life, and they will, when a word or an action, when a word is spoken to us or an action is done to us and we feel that that is a threat and it's a very real problem, we got to take it to the Lord and we got to leave it there. Just like Hezekiah did. He took it to the Lord. He left it there. The enemy came back, taunted him again. He took it to the Lord again. And a lot of times, peace will come to us only to once again feel that threat. And we got to, like I said, we got to take it to Him again. When the enemy tries to throw us into this abyss, have you ever felt your own life just going down in this dark abyss? When the enemy tries to do that to us, we got to rest in the confidence that God is always right there and that His word is true. God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. We got to pray and pray again, because just like this lesson said, God hears our prayers today. God bless you.
Amen.